I don't know what I expected after that post. Maybe part of me thought that it would end there, that he would let it out and move on, that things would settle into a tense but manageable silence between us. But as the weeks went by, the reality of what I'd done hit harder. The loss of our friendship was a constant ache, a shadow that followed me everywhere. It was more than just losing a friend. It was losing a part of myself. He had been my anchor for so long, and without him, I felt unmoored, drifting in a sea of guilt and regret. My other friends noticed, of course. They'd ask why we weren't hanging out anymore, why I wasn't at the usual spots, why I seemed distant. I gave them half-truths, saying we had a falling out but not going into detail. I was too ashamed. The thought of them knowing, of them looking at me the way I looked at myself, terrified me. I could barely handle my own self-loathing. I couldn't bear theirs too. And then there was her, his sister. I hadn't spoken to her since that night. Every time I thought about reaching out, my chest tightened with anxiety. I avoided places where I thought I might run into her, afraid of what I would say, afraid of what she might say. In my mind, I built up a narrative where she hated me as much as I hated myself. It was easier that way, to make her the villain in my head, even though I knew deep down that wasn't fair. She hadn't done anything wrong. If anything, I had dragged her into this mess, and then ghosted her when it became too real. But the thought of facing her, of having to confront the reality of what happened between us, was too much to bear. Eventually, though, I knew I couldn't avoid her forever. We ran in the same circles after all. It was inevitable that we would cross paths. It happened one night at a mutual friend's party. I saw her across the room before she saw me, and for a moment, I considered leaving. My instinct was to run, to avoid the confrontation. But something inside me stopped me from bolting. Maybe it was the guilt. Maybe it was the part of me that knew I owed her more than my silence. So I stayed, though I spent the entire night on edge, feeling her presence like a weight on my shoulders. It wasn't until later in the evening that we finally made eye contact. She was standing by the drinks table, talking to someone, and her gaze flickered over to me. I couldn't read her expression, whether it was anger, indifference, or something else entirely, but I felt a lump rise in my throat. She excused herself from her conversation and started walking toward me, and for a second, I panicked. My heart raced, and I half expected her to slap me across the face or shout at me in front of everyone. But when she reached me, she didn't do any of those things. She just stood there, looking at me with an unreadable expression. "Hey," she said softly. I swallowed, my mouth suddenly dry. "Hey." An awkward silence stretched between us, thick with all the things we weren't saying. I searched her face for any sign of how she was feeling, anger, hurt, confusion, but she kept her expression carefully neutral. I couldn't tell if that was a good thing or a bad thing. "I haven't heard from you," she said after a moment, her tone neutral. Not accusing, but not warm either. "I know," I said, looking down at my feet. "I'm sorry. I should have. I should have reached out. I just didn't know what to say." Her lips pressed into a thin line, and for the first time I saw a flicker of emotion in her eyes. Hurt. It hit me like a punch to the gut. "I get it," she said quietly. "It was weird for me too. I wasn't expecting any of it. But I don't know. I thought maybe you'd at least talk to me." Her words were like a dagger twisting in my chest. I had hurt her too, in my own selfishness and fear. I hadn't just ruined my friendship, I'd hurt someone who didn't deserve it. And in that moment, I realized how much I'd messed up. It wasn't just about what happened that night. It was about everything that came after, how I'd handled it, how I'd let my fear and guilt dictate my actions, how I'd shut her out because it was easier than dealing with my own feelings. "I'm sorry," I said again, my voice thick with emotion. "I shouldn't have ghosted you. I don't know." I felt like I messed everything up, and I didn't know how to deal with it. She sighed, crossing her arms over her chest. "Yeah, well, you're not the only one who was confused, you know. I wasn't exactly sure how to handle it either, but you disappearing on me didn't help." "I know," I said, feeling the weight of my actions even more now. "I'm sorry. I don't know how to make any of this right." She looked at me for a long moment, and I could see the conflict in her eyes. She wasn't ready to forgive me, but she wasn't ready to hate me either. It was like she was caught in the same limbo I was, unsure of how to move forward. "I don't know either," she admitted softly. "But avoiding me isn't the answer." I nodded, feeling a strange mixture of relief and guilt wash over me. Relief that she wasn't completely shutting me out, but guilt for having put her in this position in the first place. After that conversation, things didn't magically go back to normal. But it was a start. We weren't close, but at least the silence between us wasn't so heavy anymore. It was progress, however small. But with her, there was still the looming question of my best friend. He was the one person I hadn't been able to face. Every day I replayed the moment I told him over and over in my head, wondering if I could have done it differently. Wondering if I'd ever get a chance to fix things. The silence between us was unbearable, and it felt like I was walking around the gaping wound that wouldn't heal. One day, a mutual friend of ours, Chris, who had been staying out of the whole thing, pulled me aside after we ran into each other at a coffee shop. "Man, you really need to talk to him," Chris said, his tone serious. I rubbed my temples, a familiar ache of stress building behind my eyes. "I try, Chris. I called him. I told him everything." "Yeah, but telling him isn't the same as making it right," Chris said. "Look, I'm not saying he's going to forgive you overnight. Hell, I don't know if he'll forgive you at all. But you owe it to him to try." Chris's words cut hard. He was right. I had told him what happened, but I hadn't really tried to make amends. I hadn't put in the effort to show him that I regretted it, that I would do whatever it took to fix things. I had let the guilt consume me, and in doing so, I had avoided taking the hard steps toward redemption. That night, I sat on my bed with my phone in my hand, staring at his number on the screen. My heart pounded in my chest, and my fingers hovered over the call button. I was terrified. Terrified of what he might say, terrified that I might make things worse. But more than that, I was terrified of losing him forever. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I pressed the call button. The phone rang once, twice, and then asterisk, click asterisk. He picked up. There was a long, heavy silence on the other end. For a moment, I thought maybe he was going to hang up again. But then I heard his voice, quiet and tense. "What do you want?" he asked. My throat tightened, and I struggled to find the words. I want to talk. I know I messed up, man. I know I hurt you, and I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. But I miss you. I miss our friendship. And I'm willing to do whatever it takes to fix this, if you'll let me." Another silence, this one longer, more painful. I could hear him breathing on the other end, and I imagined the battle going on in his mind. Finally, he spoke. "Meet me tomorrow," he said. "At the park. Noon." And then he hung up.